It started with a toe. At first, I thought it was a hallucination, lack of sleep, too much instant coffee, too many nights alone with the dead. But the toe was there, poking from beneath the gurney in the embalming room like it had wriggled free, on its own, pale, smooth, impossibly clean, a single, perfect nail glistened under the surgical light. The smell hit me then, not just the usual chemical bite of formaldehyde, but something wetter, metallic, the raw stench of old blood and damp soil, mixed with the coppery tang of rot. I gagged. Bile burned the back of my throat, the air around me thickened. A low hum rose in the walls, like the building was breathing in slow, shuddering gasps. My hand trembled as I reached down to pull back the sheet. Cold vinyl met my skin, but there was nothing underneath. No toe, no body, just polished tiles that dripped condensation like the walls were sweating. Then I heard it, a creak of wood, above a shuffle, a whisper. My name, whispered not by a voice, but by many dry, papery mouths echoing from unseen corners. I staggered back, crashing into a steel cabinet. Tools clattered to the floor like falling teeth. The walls seemed to ripple. Just for a second, I swear the fluorescent lights flickered red, and something dripped from the ceiling. It smelled like pennies and death. Then silence. Cold, absolute silence. I clung to it like a lifeline. For a moment, I believed it was over. Just nerves, just stress. But when I turned to leave, I saw something tucked into the gurney's side rail. An old, brittle prayer card. Blackened edges. A child's face drawn in charcoal, eyes gouged out. Scribbled beneath it, "Do not listen when they call." That is how they return. Local superstition. Maybe. I remembered stories told by the old gravedigger, Elijah, the ones about the wake whalers. Spirits who slipped into the dead like maggots into fruit. You were supposed to seal mirrors, bury a knife with the heart, whisper the names backward before closing the casket. They said a girl once woke inside her own coffin, screamed for hours. No one ever admitted hearing her. I bent to pick up the card. That's when I saw the toe again, this time on the ceiling, embedded in the plaster like it was trying to claw its way through. Then it twitched. The funeral home sat at the edge of the woods, a crumbling Victorian relic turned mortuary by the county after the last one burned down. Even before I stepped inside for the first time, something about the place clawed at my gut. The air smelled wrong, like rain on scorched bone, like earth long closed to sunlight. The brass door handles were always cold, no matter the hour. Inside, it was worse. Every floorboard moaned underfoot, as if the house itself objected to being disturbed. The walls, once papered with roses, now peeled like burned skin. Fluorescent lights buzzed constantly overhead, a chorus of invisible insects chewing through the silence. At night, the cold was biting. Too cold, the furnace worked, yet the air remained frigid, as if the building exhaled something that fed on heat. It was hard to breathe, harder still to think clearly. The smells got stronger around 3 a.m. thick, sweet rot, and the bitter sting of copper that clung to the back of my tongue. I began keeping mints in my mouth, but even those tasted faintly of iron. The viewing room was the worst. I avoided it until I had to clean. One night, I found a bundle wedged inside the altar drawer, a tiny velvet pouch, moth-eaten and stiff, inside. A coin scorched black on one side and a lock of matted blonde hair, tied with rotted red thread. I touched it, and the temperature dropped so sharply my breath smoked, my vision blurred. And then I saw something, a girl, crying, her face pressed to the glass of a coffin lid, hands pounding, fingernails splitting. Behind her, shadows whispered in a tongue I didn't understand. The vision snapped like a rubber band. I fell to my knees, shaking. For a few minutes, I believed I'd imagined it. Maybe I had. Maybe the loneliness was getting to me. I laughed, too hard. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. That worked until the walls began bleeding. First a drip, then a line, thick, black-red, crawling from the corner near the prep table. I wiped it away. It returned. Always in the same place. Elijah once said the land here was cursed. Used to be old Osage burial ground. He muttered, "Some things won't stay buried. They just wait." That night, I locked every door and still heard footsteps inside the walls. In the morning, My tools were buried beneath the floorboards. The first time I heard it, I thought it was the radio. A low murmur, a gentle and almost mournful hum that vibrated beneath the thin veil of silence, emanated from the viewing room where three lifeless forms lay shrouded in perpetual slumber. At first, I attributed the sound to the static of an oldies station and the creaking of ancient pipes. The whispers were soft, indistinct of persistent susurration, that barely rose above the steady hum of the cooling machines. Yet as I listened, the word help slithered through the air, coated in despair and rot. Almost tasting of bile and copper. I paused. I strained to hear every syllable. The air in the room tasted metallic, as though I'd bitten into a cold coin, and my fingers brushed against a chill that seemed to seep into my marrow from the stone wall. The sound was not from the radio. It came from somewhere deeper, a hidden chamber of our shared nightmare. In that moment of fragile clarity, I recalled a grim old journal found tucked in the library, a diary of a man who had once served. Here, he wrote of strange rituals intended to keep restless souls at bay, recounting a nightmarish vision in which the dead whispered through cracked plaster and bleeding walls, their voices a torrent of grief and retribution. My thoughts spiraled. I wondered whether I, too, was slipping into madness. The whispered plea repeated itself, always low, always yearning. I laughed nervously, trying to mask the terror pulling in my chest, and switched the static, heavy station on in the prep room. I forced the mundane clatter of recorded music to fill the void. For a precious moment, the noise wrapped around me like a protective shroud, and the murmuring faded into insignificance. Yet, the pipes overhead groaned with a familiar, tortuous rhythm, and a dull thud in the cooler punctured that brief sanctuary. I had to be alone. I had to be sane, but the silence returned, laden with the scent of decay and the tangible texture of foreboding that clung to every cold surface. I recalled local superstitions, old wives' tales that spoke of spirits once trapped by desperate rituals. Those rites had failed here, leaving behind nothing but a cursed echo. Then, in the silence, the murmur swelled, a sharper, wailing cry that carried a promise of deeper horror. It was as if every whisper of the dead demanded recognition. Every creak of the building became a secret invitation. And just as I reached out to discern its source, the whisper turned into an eerie, collective chorus that froze me mid-step. What did they want? What dark secret had the funeral home locked away? Curiosity is a slow poison. I should have left it alone, ignored the voices, dismissed the shadows. But the whispers had taken root in my mind, blooming like rot beneath skin. Every night they grew louder, more urgent, until I couldn't sleep. My hands trembled. My tongue always tasted of copper and bile, even when I hadn't eaten. I began chewing cloves to dull it. They didn't help. The smell of decay clung to my clothes like smoke. I cornered Marge after her shift one morning, hands stuffed deep in my pockets so she wouldn't see how badly they shook. Has anything weird ever happened here? I asked. She froze, then muttered, "Every death here is weird, hon." But she knew what I meant. After a moment of silence, she finally spoke again, quiet, as though afraid the walls might listen. "There was a girl," she said. "Gray girl, we called her. County didn't claim the body. To damaged. They said, too much, wrong." She told me the cooler broke down one stormy weekend, and when they found the child's corpse bloated in black, they panicked. No family, no paperwork, no one to notice, so they buried her under the foundation, a sealed room that had once been a furnace chamber. She was supposed to stay hidden, out of sight, out of mind. But some things, Marge said, don't stay buried just because we pretend they're gone. I laughed, brittle and sharp. When she left, it sounded foreign, not quite my own. That night, I stood outside the furnace room door, the key like ice in my hand. The air around it pulsed, thick, breathing. I opened it. The stench hit me first, sweet rotten mold, tinged with the nauseating perfume of embalming fluid. The air was so dense I could almost chew it. My teeth ached. The floor groaned like it knew I was trespassing. The walls wept moisture, and the faint outline of small, bloody handprints began to emerge on the far wall. I staggered back, heart pounding. But the lights above flared bright for a second to bright, and then everything went dark. I blinked into the pitch, struggling to breathe, and then I saw it. A small wooden coffin, cracked open just enough to reveal torn white fabric and claw marks gouged into the lid. From inside, behind me, the door slammed shut and something breathed out. I heard her behind the caskets. It was near midnight. The viewing room lay in silent vigil. 3 bodies in open coffins waiting for morning light that would never reach them. I was turning off the last lamp when I heard it soft as silk tearing. Just beyond the curtain of shadows, a whisper not in any human language. Then, unmistakably, my name. I froze. The air thickened like curdled milk. A gust of chill, sharp with the stench of earth and copper, coiled around my neck. I turned slowly, flashlight trembling in my grip. Its beam flickered across the room, jittering with static. Then it landed on her. Half hunched behind the caskets stood a girl, thin, dressed in a tattered white burial gown. Her skin was ash pale, soaked at the hems with old blood. Her hair clung to her face in wet strands, but it was her mouth stitched shut with thick, black thread that turned my stomach. No lips moved, but her voice pulsed straight into my skull like a tuning fork jammed in my brain. I begged them not to. Close the lid. I staggered back, bile rushing up my throat. The taste of pennies coated my tongue. I slammed into the organ, the sharp corner bruising my hip, but I barely felt it. She didn't move, just stood, barely touching the floor, like something forgotten in a nightmare, and then gone. Like smoke pulled through a keyhole, I stood, alone in the room, panting, the silence deafening. I tried to convince myself it was grief-fueled hallucination, occupational hazard, lack of sleep. The air seemed to warm slightly. For a moment, I believed I could still leave, wash my hands of the place, until I turned back toward the hallway. Every mirror lining the corridor had fog from the inside, and etched across each surface, in backward, clawed scrawl, was a single phrase, "Still here." I ran to the staff washroom, splashed cold water on my face. My reflection trembled, not me, only the reflection. Its lips moved while mine stayed still. Open the lid, it mouthed. Later that night, I found a dusty funeral ledger hidden behind the supply shelf, scribbled in the margins. Next to one unregistered entry, "Do not embalm." She speaks when touched, but someone had, and I had touched her. The stitches on her mouth were starting to loosen. I had to know if it was real or if I was finally losing my mind. Sleep had become impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face behind my eyelids, sewn lips flexing, whispering words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. I stopped eating. My stomach churned with a constant bitterness, the taste of metal and old water. My gums bled when I brushed my teeth. I didn't recognize myself in the mirror anymore. My eyes were darker. My smile didn't feel connected to me. On the 3rd night, something scratched beneath the prep room floor. A low, wet dragging sound, like a body being pulled across linoleum. I followed it down to the old furnace room, compelled more than curious. The air was heavy with mold and rot, like the breath of something ancient. The scent burned my sinuses. The walls glistened with sweat that wasn't moisture, it felt oily, alive. I tore up the rotting floorboards with a crowbar, hands blistered and raw. The wood cracked easily, almost like it wanted to be removed. Beneath, nestled in the dirt like a buried secret, was a coffin no bigger than a suitcase. Handmade. The wood was splintered, blackened, the lid split just enough to fill in for screams. I reached out and lifted it open, even as something inside me begged me not to. The girl's bones were curled in a fetal position, jaw broken open from strain. Her fingers tiny, shattered things clutched a filthy piece of paper. I pried it from her grip. It was a torn page from an old book of rites, not Christian, older, handwritten, smudged ink and blood. I could barely read the words, "Return." Not what cries from below. Silence is mercy. I should have run, but the air behind me shifted, grew hot. I turned to see the walls of the room pulsing, veins pushing through the plaster. A heartbeat thumped beneath the concrete dot, and then a moment of calm. Everything stopped. The air cooled, the smell faded. My thoughts cleared, like a fever breaking. I could breathe again. I could think, until the lights flared red and I felt breath not cold, but hot and wet on the back of my neck. And then her voice whispered, Not in my head this time, but right at my ear. You opened the door. Now close. Your eyes. The truth didn't come all at once. It uncoiled slowly, like a centipede slipping out of a corpse. I stopped logging the bodies. I stopped calling home. I'd forgotten the sound of my own voice. My mouth tasted like old pennies and ashes every time I touched a surface door handles, steel tables, even the skin of the corpses. I felt something pulse beneath, like a second heartbeat waiting for mine to stop. The ledger came apart in my hands one night. Pages yellowed and crumbling, ink soaked with something sticky. Between brittle sheets, tucked behind falsified death records and forged cremation certificates, I found a map, hand-drawn. Shaky lines, it showed the funeral home, but beneath it tunnels. Runes that didn't exist on any blueprint. Dot at the center, a name scrawled in charcoal. Imelda. Elijah had whispered it once. A girl abandoned in the woods by settlers, left to die of fever. They said she whispered to the animals, said she spoke backward, said she came back wrong. The elders buried her in sacred soil, mouths sewn, lungs stuffed with salt. That should have bound her. But someone had built over the grave. The ritual broken. The caskets she whispered through weren't random. I checked. All female. All children. All with no necks of kin. Something was pulling them in, feeding on them like kindling to a fire long starved. And I had opened the lid. I tried salt. I tried mirrors covered in black veils. I tried Osage prayers I found carved into the walls of the crawl space behind the cremator. For one night, it worked. I slept. The air cleared. No whispers. Until the walls began to bleed. Thick, tar-like. Blood poured from the cracks between bricks, bubbling as if it were boiling inside the walls. The temperature dropped. My breath froze midair. From the embalming table, a body sat up. No eyes. Just stitched sockets and a gaping, grinning mouth. It pointed behind me. The mirror over the sink reflected something tall, thin. Its face was hers, but stretched like wet fabric over bone. She was growing stronger. I ran into the hallway, but the lights burst one by one. In the flickering dark, I heard every corpse begin to whisper her name in unison. And then another voice joined them. It was mine. That night, she came through the wall. It started with a whisper beneath the floorboards, as it always did, dry and brittle, like dead leaves scraping against stone. But then came the creaking, slow and deliberate, like someone walking barefoot through bone dust. The embalming room chilled to meet locker cold. The linoleum slicked beneath my shoes. I tasted rust. My gums bled without cause. I tried to barricade the door with gurneys and metal trays, but the walls pulsed, literally pulsed, veins bulging beneath the faded floral wallpaper. A low hum rose from the foundation, vibrating up through my knees. The air was thick with rot and burning hair, so dense it clung to the back of my throat like wet gauze. I fell to my knees as the floor split along an old seam in the tile. Steam hissed out. From the widening crack, a single, pale arm reached through. Delicate. Wrong. The fingers were far too long. The skin blistered and torn. Her nails scraped along the metal table leg, producing a squeal that sent rivulets of pain behind my eyes. I ran. Down the hall, past the chapel with its overturned pews, past the memorial photos, which now flickered like film negatives. The eyes of every portrait had been cut out. I made it to the loading bay. I had keys. I had hope. I threw open the rear door to the van, and she was inside, folded neatly, impossibly, in the body bag I swore I'd cremated 2 nights ago. Her mouth was open now, the thread gone. Her voice poured out like smoke, singing something backwards, a lullaby made of teeth and static. My nose bled. I screamed until I tasted bile and copper. I slammed the door shut and bolted it, heart hammering like a funeral drum. I thought I'd escaped. Just for a second, I believed. Then I turned around. The walls of the funeral home had melted into a tunnel of flesh and brick, tendrils of skin connecting door frames to doorways. The floor pulsed. The overhead lights spun in circles, flashing. Images of her childhood, burned books, dolls with no eyes, a pyre in the woods. Her face at its center, smiling through flame. At the far end of the hallway, something slithered toward me on a tide of embalming fluid and blood. And from inside my mouth, her voice whispered again, I lost time after that. Hours, maybe days. The funeral home swallowed the sun. Windows showed only darkness now, and no clocks worked. My watch spun backward. My mouth was always dry, yet I could taste blood. My throat burned like I'd swallowed ash. My skin stung with every breath, coated in sweat that smelled faintly of copper and old milk. I wandered the corridors, hoping to find a door that still led out. Every hallway curved back on itself. The chapel had no exit anymore, just pews that bled when touched and hymnals that whispered in children's voices. The embalming room was gone. In its place, a staircase spiraled downward into red stone and root-veined walls that breathed like lungs. Struggling through final gasps, I don't know when I started hearing her inside my own thoughts, not as words, but images, visions of the settlers' fire, their crude ritual, tongues cut, salt poured into ears. The child buried beneath cedar and bone charms. The elders had marked her grave with a sigil carved in deer antler, but it was broken now, discarded in a supply closet behind stacks of unused caskets. I held it once, briefly. It burned my palm, and I dropped it. A mistake. I tried to fix it, tried to reseal the grave. I traced the sigil in my own blood. I recited prayers I barely remembered from childhood. For a moment, the air calmed. The rot pulled back. Silence fell. But the calm was not mercy. It was her breathing in. The walls cracked open. A flood of embalming fluid, dark and thick and screaming, poured through the hallway. It washed over me, filled my nose, my mouth. It tasted like bile and metal. I clawed my way into the viewing room, vomiting on the floor. And she was waiting. Not the girl from the coffin. Not anymore. She was taller now, eyes black and bottomless. Her skin stretched tight over bone, and her mouth, once stitched, was now a yawning, endless grin. Hands outstretched, she whispered with my mother's voice, my childhood voice, my own voice in turn. I screamed until my jaw locked, my legs failed. She stepped closer, her fingers brushing my face, ice cold and velvet soft. And then I saw them, the others behind her. They didn't move. They just stood there, dozens of them, pale, gray, rotting, lined the walls like dolls forgotten in a child's nightmare. Their mouths hung open, tongues dry and black, some missing entirely. The room vibrated with soundless screams. I heard it not through my ears, but through the marrow of my bones, a low, grating hum, like teeth grinding behind a wall. I could smell copper again, stronger now, mixed with something worse, burned hair, bile, something dead but still trying to breathe. She stepped forward, her body no longer human, but a patchwork of what had once been stretched flesh, wet lace, bone bound with rusted pins. Her eyes were bottomless now. Looking at them made something in my mind snap. I felt my last sane thought drift away, swallowed whole by the storm building in my skull. She touched my forehead, the skin seared, visions flooded in. The fire, the ritual, the betrayal, not by the settlers, but by her own mother, who had led her into the woods under a moonless sky, whispered a lullaby, then buried her alive to protect the village. The girl hadn't died, not really. Her soul had stuck, wedged between this world and whatever waited below, bound but watching, always watching. And now I had unbound her. For a breath, everything stopped. The corpses vanished. The room became the quiet funeral parlor I remembered. The scent of lilies returned, clean and calm. Light filtered in through the stained glass. I stood alone. The altar glowed. Maybe it was over. Maybe I had broken through. But the silence, blood, crimson droplets dripped from the ceiling. The lilies wilted into worms. The glass shattered, leaving only darkness outside. I blinked and I was no longer standing. I was lying inside one of the caskets. My limbs wouldn't move. My chest felt full, heavy. I couldn't scream, couldn't breathe. She hovered above me now, her face no longer stretched. She looked like a child again, sad, smiling. "We don't bury them to forget," she whispered, her stitched fingers pressing my eyelids closed. "We bury them to keep them in." The lid shut. The last thing I heard before the nails sealed the coffin was my own voice laughing. Somewhere in the dark beyond the walls, the phone began to ring. Someone else had just taken the night shift. All the bodies that had whispered before now standing, watching, waiting.